Welcome everybody to another element of European Health Tech Innovation Week. This is 5 days of extremely valuable, important conferences and speakers looking at some of the key issues in healthcare, technology, and innovation. I'm delighted to announce that one of our most important sponsors is Thrive, and we have the director from Thrive, Jacob, here. Hello, Jacob. Nice to see you. How are you?
Hi, Barry. Great to be here. Yeah, very good. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So a reminder to our audience, this is the actual conference track talking about developing health wearables in a rapidly changing world. So obviously we are looking at some incredibly profound, important issues in healthcare. One of the most important themes which comes up in all of our conferences is the necessity to move countries and citizens away from sick care towards wellness. There are also a lot of other important issues regarding the evolution of collecting information about patients and providing that data to the pharma industry, directly to healthcare providers and so forth. And wearables are absolutely in the center of this. So we're very excited to be talking to Jacob, and we're very proud to be sponsored by Thrive. So what we'd like to do, Jacob, is just ask you to begin with, tell us a little bit, please, about your background and a little bit about Thrive. How did you guys get to where you are today?
Thanks, Barry. Yeah, so my background is in sensor technologies and physics. I worked as a postdoc for a while at the University of Sussex before working on applications in and around physiology detection and looking at the signals relating to the heart and lungs and various other things, and eventually realized that I was kind of in the middle of this growing industry around wearables. And so we set up Thrive as a way of bringing together many of the skills that I had personally at the time and a network around me, and to offer that as a service to people, to be able to actually bring these ideas to life in the form of commercial, practical applications around wearables. And over the last 7 years, we've built the company to a point where we're looking at applications all over the place in different areas, different sectors, and with teams across the globe as well, but always focused predominantly in health and wellness, looking to have impact in that space and to change the world for the better, as you say, moving away from sick care and looking at long-term measurements and systems that support that health paradigm.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. Really looking forward to our conversation. Could we take a step back? We have quite literally many thousands of viewers from around the world. Some of them, of course, are deeply embedded in the very center of the world of healthcare and tech and innovation. Others might be involved, but only peripherally. And of course, we might have hundreds or thousands of clinicians who maybe went to medical school 20 years ago. And I highly doubt they all were wearing Apple Watches when they were at med school 20 years ago. Let alone, being intimately aware. So just very briefly, let's start from first principles, so to speak. What do you mean when you talk about wearables? What are examples of wearables?
Well, there's a long history over the last decade, I suppose, of an evolution of that. Really, it's people think of things like Fitbit as a case study in what a wearable is, and traditionally that's what people immediately link, I suppose. Things like Google Glass ended up causing problems and represented a particular point in the history of wearables, but we're now in a position in the world where wearables are dominated by things we already recognize: glasses, watches, shoes, technologies that already have had acceptance into people's lives are becoming, I guess, tools or Trojan horses for other amazing health tech applications. So if you embed sensors into glasses, you can look at all sorts of things, from brain signals to stress indicators to people's what people are looking at, which direction they're looking in. It's very exciting to kind of look at the form factors that exist and try and find ways of enabling those and looking at how they can be useful for measuring particular signals. So there are then more exotic examples of wearables that have less traction in the market just because they are not respected and accepted as something people would wear. So chest straps for sports applications are something people use a lot, but the majority of the population probably wouldn't want to wear one of those things. And I mean, some of the best standout examples are things like the Aura Ring, I suppose, in the last few years, just seeing how much technology can be squeezed down into a form factor like that. It's really exciting stuff. Yes. And many other form factors. I think we have about 35 or 40 different form factors in our database of areas that we've worked on or been involved with. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a lot. That's very interesting. I could probably have thought of two or three, like a watch, like you said, or something you put in your shoe, or something. That's very interesting that there's that many already. So, as I mentioned at the very beginning, and you also touched on that, we have big challenges in society, don't we? We have big healthcare challenges, like new diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes. We also have changes in the nature of society. In almost every country around the world, we have an aging society. So all these things are resulting in higher costs for the nation or for the healthcare services to deliver healthcare. But of course, we obviously have limited budgets. We do understand that innovation and technology innovation holds out the promise, doesn't it, of enabling clinicians to deliver better healthcare services at lower cost. And you were talking about this concept of health tech moving towards consumer tech, and the fact that right now, for example, obviously, healthcare, in fact, is primarily sick care, isn't it? You go to the doctor when you're unwell. You dial 999 when you have a health problem. You go to the hospital when you have a acute health problem. But that's not the answer over the long term. So let's talk about that a little bit. What are some of the things that you're aware of in these bigger themes? What are some of the issues regarding health tech and moving there towards consumer tech? And what is Thrive doing in that area?
Well, it's a big topic. We could talk about that for the rest of the day, I guess. But I mean, let's start with some of the basics. You mentioned a watch. You know, Apple Watch is obviously the standout sort of poster child for health tech enabled consumer electronics, and it's interesting just how simple some of that stuff is. You know, the idea of an ECG measurement with two leads, two fingers, so you touch one side of the watch and you get this measurement. You know, we were doing this as researchers sort of 10 or 15 years ago in the lab, and there were questions about how useful that would be. But of course, as time goes on and you start to look into those signals, as Apple have done, and become qualified as a medical device as they've done, you realize that, you know, atrial fibrillation as a simple starting point is something you can have huge impact by detecting early. You can't detect that once somebody's had a heart attack and they're on a hospital bed. So that's a great example of predictive and preventative measures that can be fairly simply implemented these days, and it's that kind of stuff that we get very excited about, because that's just one of you know, myriad of different things that can be prevented. And as you say, you know, sick care unfortunately dominates the NHS in the UK and globally. You know, health services are built around ambulances and hospital beds and operations, but there are many opportunities to predict things in advance. The way that we do that is by using much richer data that's taken over a long period of time. And in fact, the quality of that data is fairly poor for a point-to-point measurement. So you wouldn't expect the quality of a 12-lead ECG from an Apple Watch, but you will get continuous trend data over many weeks and months. And therefore the information is different, but equally useful and valid in predicting outcomes.
That's very interesting. So you have things like the Apple Watch. They are rapidly evolving, aren't they, in the technological capability and the measuring capability of them. What are other examples? You mentioned shoe, for example, not necessarily shoe, but what are other examples which are, I don't know, unheard of or not really known 5 or 10 years from now, but that are kind of entering the market, or people are beginning to familiarize themselves with them now?
I mean, there's so many. I'll just be anecdotal and just dive into a few applications. So I guess looking at mental health is a really interesting area. So being able to measure brain signals and deduce a level of mental state, whether that be extreme condition where somebody is suffering from severe mental issues and is struggling with a condition, all the way to a point of you know, general well-being upkeep, maybe looking at stress markers in relation to sporting training, for example. There are lots of ways that stress can be measured and interpreted. But it's only really possible to do those measurements when you're constantly looking. You can't do those things in a surgery with very much accuracy. So that's another good example of, you know, the need for trend data. We're working on a collaboration with a team who are looking at agitation as a marker for when people have dementia and are affected by dementia. They become agitated. And to be able to detect that from a foot based technology, should we say, for want of not giving away too much of the information I may not be
Sure.
able to give away.
Sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at the long-term data and to use machine learning to pick out those trends which are imperceptible if you measure something very, very briefly with a very good piece of equipment, if that makes any sense.
Extremely interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. There's another big theme in society and concept in the evolution of application of technologies in healthcare, which relate to the pharma industry, obviously. And in the pharma industry, for people that don't have expertise in this, we're talking about the drug manufacturing and distribution sector. This is about prescription pills, for example, that are provided to you by your GP. These are produced by the global pharma industry, and each pill has gone through a very long journey. From example, at the very beginning of that pill's journey, you might discover a new molecule, or you might accidentally discover the impact of a particular molecule or drug on human health. You then have to figure out if you can manufacture that molecule. You have to test that molecule on animals and then in humans. Then you have to get regulatory approval. Then you have to obviously manufacture that drug, distribute it, get clinicians aware of that drug and getting them prescribing. So it's a very long journey, but in the middle of that journey, there's an unbelievably important element, which every drug that you have ever been prescribed or taken has been through, and that are the so-called clinical trials. So everybody in the healthcare industry is aware of that, but I provide these more basic introductions just to help a lot of our listeners around the world who might not have been working directly in the drug or in the pharma industry. So tell us, Jacob, a little bit about clinical trials, just very, very briefly, your understanding of what clinical trials are, what they do, and then love to hear about where do wearables fit in that theme?
Well, I think you've done a fantastic introduction to clinical trials, so I won't labour that too much. I think, yeah, the ability to validate the efficacy of a particular drug or indeed an intervention of any sort is very important. So in our world where we're looking at medical device development, essentially, where we build things that have to be medically accurate and certified, there is a need to use clinical trials and the clinical trial process to both validate those technologies and then further down the line to then validate drugs and health interventions that need to go through that process. And I think what's interesting is the pharma industry and generally the clinical trials industry has seen the opportunity with using wearables in that context. And I think there is. Sorry, carry on.
No, please continue.
Well, I was going to say there are still quite a lot of blockers with regard to adoption of those kind of technologies. It's a very highly regulated industry, as you'll be aware, and the audience will probably recognise. It's very important to get these things right and to configure them correctly to give results. They're very expensive to run, traditionally extremely expensive, and often prone to failure. So, with wearables becoming more medicalized and there being more options for using medical devices such as the Apple Watch ECG function, it's now possible to do what are called real world trials, where you can actually provide a cohort of people with a particular device, send them out into the world on their own terms in the real world, getting on with their day. And it's a much less constructed environment to test particular interventions. So it can be very beneficial from that point of view, but it's also cheaper and it's also easier to scale. You know, you just have to buy more devices and onboard more people into the trial and set them on their way. So it can be a much better way for multiple reasons. I think the trick really is to find those technologies that have the right performance and have the right benchmarking against them to be able to go through that process. And we're still at the early stage of that. And there's, like I say, lots of regulation and lots of prior process, I suppose, that blocks a lot of that stuff from happening. But it's a very, very exciting and fast-moving space.
Yes. So love to hear more about that. Are you guys working right now? Is Thrive working with wearables businesses that are involved in the clinical trials ecosystem?
We have a lot of collaborators in that space. We're, as a company, becoming 13485, which is the medical device standard. We're becoming certified to be able to operate in that space more. Yeah, because of what we do, we have quite deep access into emerging technologies, which will filter through into those trial environments. So I think the next 5 years will be quite pivotal. But there are lots of opportunities, and anyone who's in that space who's interested in collaborating, please definitely reach out to us, because we're very excited about it. Yeah.
Excellent. I don't know if these things are confidential. Are you allowed to talk about any particular case studies or anything that maybe you've done historically, which is public domain information, or is it all quite medically confidential or whatever?
Well, it's more client confidential than medical. So I mean, we have. I mean, I can talk more generally about some of the players in the industry, really, who I think are doing good stuff. I mean, VivoSense have just recently landed quite a big investment to be working in the clinical trial space. I think they're a good case study for kind of people pioneering in that space. And there's a lot of traction. We have conversations with some of the biggest companies in the world around their strategy for deploying remote trials. So it's definitely something that the big teams are working on. I can't really go into any more detail about the specific.
No. I'll ask the question in a different way to try and tease more information out of you.
Yeah.
No, just being cheeky, sorry for that. Help us to understand how that works on a more practical basis for the pharma company. So you have a global pharma company, they want to engage in some type of clinical trial, but with wearables, instead of having to recruit people who might have to come into a GP's office or into a hospital or into some type of a physical center for the conducting of the trial, wearables enable the patients or the participants in the trial maybe to engage in the trial from home. And what's happening? The wearables are collecting information would have been collected in the hospital or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the specific design of the trial can be very varied, but ultimately the wearable would be provided to the trial participants, even remotely. They may not need to come to an environment to even have that prescribed. They may or provided. They may be sent that with a set of instructions as to what to do. It can be as simple as wear an Apple Watch or wear a particular piece of kit, allow it to connect to the network and upload the data. And then maybe there is a procedure for taking the medical intervention, the placebo or the trial drug, or maybe it's just a trial that relates to something more general, and then it's done just in a person's environment. Maybe it's a person who has a particular ailment, and it's a data set that's being pulled together to uncover more nuance about that condition. So it can be very varied in what the trial is looking for. If it's then a case of also adding in subjective reporting as well, which can be very important. We could add in digital technologies to that, so that people just simply report their subjective well-being or how they're feeling after an intervention through an iPad or through another medium, through a mobile device. And that means that the whole trial can be kind of pushed into a normal environment, much easier to scale and administer, and it becomes cheaper.
Yes. That's amazing. Potentially very, very large, dramatic changes in what can be accomplished in clinical trials and the collecting of real-world evidence. So very exciting times. What are some of the data issues? Sometimes we hear about, we're drowning in data, but where's the useful information? Often you hear about privacy issues. Sometimes we hear about data ownership issues. Are these things relating to what Thrive does and your relationship with your clients, or is that not really an area that you guys are involved in?
That's a big question. Well, there's increasingly issues with data. We see lots of headlines about passwords and insecurity of passwords and these kind of things, which affect quite systemically. I mean, there's always been a tendency within health tech and health innovation to be very privacy centric. So I think generally there's a good culture within the industry and within the industries that we engage with as providers of technology. It's never perfect, of course, and as soon as something like one of the 0-day bugs in the Linux operating system gets uncovered, and you realize that people have had access to the depths of the infrastructure for time immemorial, you realize where the real challenges are. I think there's always a question around what data is collected, where that goes, whether it needs to be collected in the first place, and what's done with it afterwards. And I think GDPR has been a very positive step forward, but there are also plenty of other legislations and processes around data that are pretty well adhered to, although there are obviously cases where it's not so good. Lots of examples in the consumer space of startups coming to market with technologies forgetting to do anything about security at all, and there's some horror stories for sure out there. But with the medical side,
Yes.
It's a little tighter.
Yes, exactly. Well, good to hear that overall, like you said, there is quite a strong underlying attitude within healthcare about privacy and data protection. So is it true I should move away from using my password 123 on all of my devices and on all of my applications and do something more sophisticated than that? Is 123 no longer the password I should use?
I think 4567 should cover you.
Perfect. I'm going to write that down. No, pardon me for being cheeky, but it's such a big issue, isn't it? And then are you guys involved in providing consulting in these areas of data, or are you more about the hardware, the design, and this type of thing? Love to hear a little bit more about Thrive and some of the services that you guys are offering.
Yeah, so we I guess we have a sort of 70% bias towards developing physical tech.
Okay.
That's our core thing, really. We've over the years become very well experienced with creating prototypes and building out technologies all the way through to mass production. So that whole
Nice.
kind of physical enabler part, where you have sensors and you have processing power and you have a connection to the outside world, and that thing is contained within something that people want to use,
Yes.
whereas traditional medical devices maybe a little bit less so. We're really consumer focused and user experience focused in what we do. So that part's very important. We do a lot of app development and back-end development. So we put together the interfaces and the connectivity for those systems. And then data science is the sort of glue that turns all of that stuff into something actionable. And this is where having a good relationship with the mindset of the clinician and the mindset of the patient is so important, because you can easily create measurement technologies and you can create data, but it's really about turning that into something that not just makes sense from an insight point of view, but also correlates with existing care pathways, correlates with existing ways of engaging with health that people can understand on their own terms. So that's quite an important part, really, and it's the softer side, I suppose you may call it, of what we do in terms of engineering versus that sort of service design piece. And we do sort of consult on various things, especially in the clinical trial space, actually understanding what the best technologies would be for a particular trial, and being able to sort of configure and understand how those trials would be actually administered. That's quite a practical thing that we do.
Excellent. Are you guys focusing on any particular geography? We have a lot of people that are participating this week in European Health Tech Innovation Week from the UK, but also elsewhere in Europe, and also from North America. Pardon me, North America, for example, and farther afield. What's your geographic focus?
We are completely agnostic geographically. We work with teams all the way from North America down to the Middle East, all across Europe, everywhere. Yeah. So,
yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Could we go back to the medical device, if you will, theme and wearables as medical devices? So could you help our audience to understand some of the nuance there? And what is a medical device? When is a wearable not a medical device? And is that a geographic thing? In other words, is it defined per country or per healthcare system and that type of thing?
Wow, again, another massive topic, and actually one that I'm not the best qualified in my team to talk about, but I'll give you the sort of broad brushstroke around that. It's a complex area. There is a lot of regulation that varies geographically, very much so. There are some harmonies between countries. The UK and the rest of Europe is still very well aligned, but unfortunately there is the potential for divergence there. And the FDA and the North American sort of process is slightly different, but there are similarities. So what makes a medical device? Well, in the jurisdiction you're selling that technology, essentially you need to have evidence to back up the claims that you're making in relation to what that device does.
Right.
There's a grey area, of course, and this is a grey area that lots of people start producing technologies into, which is kind of the wellness space, where you find
Yes.
applications that are very similar to the health applications, but you don't make any explicit claims about how that technology is going to medically change you. So it may be a stress reduction technology, or it may be something to do with, you know, simple monitoring, such as a sports belt that measures your heart rate. You may want to know, in terms of
Yes.
your training, how fast your heart is racing, and that's not giving you any medical advice. So it's basically a well-being device or a consumer device. And I think it's important, if you're developing a technology, to be very discerning with whether you want to go into a medical device development immediately, or whether you want to go more towards a well-being market initially. And we have teams who are very predominantly going straight into medical device development because they have a very clearly medical technology that really isn't about well-being, and others who see that well-being market is a very good first base, as it were, before they foray into the more deep medical version of that technology. So it's a strategic thing as well, and the orders of magnitude in terms of development costs and timelines. You know, you can get a consumer device to market maybe within a year if you're really putting the pressure on. A medical device maybe 2 to 3 years if you're, again, putting a lot of effort behind it. So you've got to really think about that traction part. How quickly do you have to get there, and have you got a proposition that would work in a wellness market? And then the medical thing comes a bit later.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's very interesting and very relevant. I think a lot of the entrepreneurs and device and wearables people within the ecosystem that'll be watching this show right now need to understand that is quite a profound difference, isn't it? The levels of regulatory approval that you have to go to, whether it's an unregulated consumer device, or whether you're going to go farther beyond that. Have you seen any trends since you guys launched the business, and since you're obviously in the very center of the wearables ecosystem? Are there any trends where businesses launch as consumer facing and then they actually realize, well, that's too broad or challenging compared to becoming a more specialized? In other words, going from B to C at the beginning to becoming a much more specialized B2B proposition, or the opposite? Are there any trends from launching an idea, getting a device developed, getting it into the market, and then realizing over the years, well, in fact, we ought to be shifting from, like I said, B2B to B2C, or vice versa? Do you see any general trends, or is it just too varied of a sector?
Yeah, it's quite tricky to pick out a trend, I'd say. I mean, I think you've highlighted the sort of B2C or B2B part there, which is very important. If you're trying to sell directly to consumers, the scale of the operation has to be completely different. You need a huge amount of marketing budget, and you need to be able to focus so carefully on that segmentation and targeting. So that's a challenge in itself. If you go down the medical route, you may have longer timelines, and it may be more costly to do the development work and deploy those technologies, but you can often find that the marketing and the focus and the precision of the technology that you're developing is much clearer at the beginning. And we see a lot of consumer companies who do very well grow very quickly and become almost isolated because they kind of get overtaken by some other teams who have kind of more focus on the specific use cases and can come in from the side. So it's a really risky, challenging place to operate in the consumer space. But you can get a lot of kind of IP security, and you can get a lot of market monopoly if you're a very targeted medical device with a very clear pattern to back it up. I think that's a very attractive proposition, especially when we're developing those technologies, because we have a very, very clear measurement that needs to be done, a very clear data set that needs to be taken, rather than a consumer device which is kind of often hedging its bets quite a bit as to what it's actually going to do. You see at the other end, you know, when you have these huge companies, their only play is to be mass market consumer wearables or devices, and therefore the feature set has to be extremely deep and very accessible to all sorts of application areas, which is super challenging. And that's why Apple spend so much on a single device development versus a very focused device.
Actually, that's extremely interesting, isn't it? The relationship between gigantic global corporates that have wearables that do have a very broad proposition versus very, very specialized ones. What was it? Was it Jawbone? Were they a wearables company? Did they go bust, or have they been absorbed or disappeared within another business? Were they too specialized?
I can't remember who they were subsumed by, but they were bought up. It may well have been Google. I can't remember now, but I think the sort of Fitbit, the original Fitbit world of an accelerometer, which is a motion sensing device in a wrist, in a piece of plastic in the wrist with a battery. It just became commoditized so quickly that some of these teams, they just didn't really have a proposition beyond doing that. And I think that was a kind of early consolidation when a lot of those companies disappeared, and even Fitbit, the poster child of that era, was subsumed, of course, by Google.
Yes. Yes. I guess that's the challenge, isn't it? If you're a small business and if your proposition is quite narrow, I'm thinking, I guess, more like Garmin for navigation. And of course, now every smartphone has bucket loads of navigation functionality, doesn't it? So the very, very specialist, all we offer you as navigation providers will find it challenging in a mass market proposition. So yeah, interesting. Hey, well, look, I'm sorry to say we're kind of running out of time, but I would like to continue this discussion. We certainly hope that we can talk to you further, Jacob, and learn more about what Thrive is doing, perhaps at Giant's flagship event in December, the Giant Health event, as well as more involvement with you in this European Health Tech Innovation Week program this week. Could we just summarize in terms of any vision or anything you want to share with us regarding the future? Where do you see wearables, for example, 5 or 10 years from now? What will be the difference in the ecosystem? What will be different about wearables, about patients' use of wearables 5 or 10 years from now?
Wow, I could have summed that up in a statement, have I? That's a tricky one. I guess I'll part by saying, as a company, we positioned ourselves to be extremely focused on impact and to have built that into our kind of constitution, as it were. So we're really excited by the idea of the positive disruptions that can happen through wearables. We're really looking to find people to collaborate with on that mission, and anything that happens in the next few years is going to be really important in terms of what we deliver. We're really looking to change how the NHS in the UK or other health systems operate, to link data on a long-term, real-time basis to preventing things happening in people's lives that they don't want to happen and ending them up in hospital, and to hopefully reverse the pressure on those health systems, which has become really acute through COVID.
Absolutely.
And that's really where we want to be. So if that doesn't happen, then I guess we've maybe failed in our mission, but that's where we're going. Yes. If anyone wants to get involved and join us, we'd love to talk.
Absolutely. Well, look, you guys have obviously been very successful already, and it's great to have followed your impressive trajectory over the past few years. So once again, sorry to say we have run out of time, but this has been extremely interesting. So on behalf of Giant Health and the organizers of European Health Tech Innovation Week, we would like to say thank you, Jacob Skinner from Thrive Wearables. Great to speak with you. Extremely interesting conversation, very informative. I've learned a lot and also found it very interesting. So Jacob, thank you very much.
Thanks, Barry. Great to speak with you and looking forward to the event in December.
Excellent. So this has been Jacob Skinner, who is a director of Thrive Wearables. Thrive is developing health wearables in a rapidly changing world. If anybody wants to learn more information about them, you can connect on the European Health Tech Innovation Week app, which is probably the app that you have on your phone that you're watching this show right now on. We also will be able to provide you with links to Thrive Wearables, an important sponsor and supporter of European Health Tech Innovation Week. I'm Barry Schreier. I hope you found this conversation with Jacob interesting, and thank you very much for listening. Thanks again, Jacob, and thanks to Thrive for the valuable sponsorship. We love to work with you guys, and we're grateful for your support. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.